Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we've got some pretty interesting and exciting benchmarks to get through because we're finally getting around to testing Intel's Ice Lake architecture for the first time. This has been a long time coming. It's Intel's first real attempt at a CPU on their struggling 10nm process, and in this video we'll be comparing it to Intel's 14nm offerings to see how it stacks up in terms of performance. Now, I did say it's Intel's first real attempt because we did see a 10nm CPU launch last year that used 10nm for the first time. This chip lineup was codenamed Cannon Lake, but it was a bit of a fail. Only one processor ever saw the light of day, the Core i3-8121U, and it was a measly dual core clocked only at up to 3.2 GHz with no iGPU at all. It was used in a single Lenovo laptop model plus a small handful of NUCs, and because of its low-end specs, it never really saw much traction. So Ice Lake is Intel's first real entry to the CPU market with 10nm, given there are many more SKUs available and we're already seeing decent uptake in the market across ultra-portable laptops. Instead of one CPU, there are 11 in Intel's Ice Lake lineup across 9 watts, 15 watts, and 28 watt power categories. So yes, these are still designed for low power ultra-portables and other mobile devices, at least for now. Once again, Intel's naming scheme here is pretty confusing, which makes it hard to distinguish between the various models. Previously, Intel used U suffixes to denote 15 watt products and Y to denote 9 watts. Now this is relegated to a single number. The 1065G7, for example, is a 15 watt CPU, while the 1060G7 is 9 watts. All 15 watt products get a 5 in the fourth digit and 9 watt parts get a 0. I much prefer the use of U or Y. I think that's so much clearer for buyers rather than hiding this crucial performance indicator among a bunch of other letters and numbers. What has become clearer this generation though is the integrated graphics capabilities. The G suffix tells us exactly what sort of CPU configuration we're getting. G7 denotes RS Plus with the full 64 execution units unlocked, G4 is RS Plus cut down to 48 execution units, and then G1 gives us UHD graphics with 32 execution units. All use Intel's new Gen 11 GPU, which is one of the bigger changes to Ice Lake compared to previous 14nm generations, and it's a much needed change. Since Skylake was introduced, 15 watt CPUs have largely been stuck with GPUs that pack only 24 execution units with an architecture from 2015, and that continues to be the case with 2019's 14nm refresh codenamed Comet Lake. Some 28 watt parts would push this up to 48 execution units, but that was generally the maximum you could find. Now, the base G1 tier includes 32 execution units, so we're already seeing a 33% increase to core count if you want to call execution units cores. And the top end also gets a bump, but crucially you can still find 64 execution unit G7 graphics within a 15 watt power envelope. So Intel are bringing a significant jump to graphics capabilities within the existing TDP, allowing it to better compete with the beefy graphics AMD provides in Ryzen Mobile. On top of this, Gen 11 graphics provide a number of architectural changes, including support for variable rate shading, adaptive sync, display stream compression, and a faster media encoder. This really is the key benefit to getting Ice Lake over previous generations. Before we get back into our Ice Lake discussion, just want to give a quick shout out to the Hardware Unboxed merch store. If you're ever interested in supporting the channel directly, then this is a great way to do it. We've got t-shirts, we've got hoodies, we've got mugs, we've even got some new limited edition holiday themed items like this happy unboxing sweater. So if you're interested in all of that, check it out. Links are in the description. There are also significant changes on the CPU front, thanks to an all-new CPU core in Sunny Cove. Intel are promising an 18% IPC increase over Skylake, support for AVX512, new dynamic tuning capabilities, and a much better memory controller that supports DDR4 3200 and LPDDR4X 3733 speeds. While IPC has seen a large increase according to Intel, this has been offset by lower clock speeds across the Ice Lake line. Take the flagship 15 watt part that we're looking at today, the Core i7-1065G7. It gets the full 64 execution unit experience on the GPU side, giving us the benefits of Gen 11 graphics, but it only packs 4 Sunny Cove CPU cores with a base clock of 1.3 GHz and a single core turbo of 3.9 GHz, plus that all-important all-core speed of just 3.5 GHz. This is well below what you get with Intel's other current generation CPU line, Comet Lake. The top-end Comet Lake chip built on 14 nanometers, offers a much worse integrated GPU but bumps up the CPU to 6 cores, clocked at 1.1 GHz base. Alternatively, you can get a Core i7 quad-core with a 1.8 GHz base and 4.3 GHz all-core turbo. While these 15-watt parts generally don't run at the advertised clock speeds in sustained workloads, even comparing just these rated frequencies shows a massive discrepancy. Base clocks comparing quad-core to quad-core are nearly 40% higher for Comet Lake, although this narrows to 23% comparing all-core turbos. But with Ice Lake only receiving an 18% average gain to IPC, you can already see that this is probably going to struggle to outperform what Intel already has on 14 nanometer in CPU limited workloads. And again, this whole situation with Intel having both 10 nanometer Ice Lake and 14 nanometer Comet Lake on the market at the same time as part of their 10th generation only serves to confuse customers, with Comet Lake boasting a beefier CPU and Ice Lake taking the GPU crown. Regular everyday Joes will have to do even more research than ever before to ensure that what they are getting is the right product for the use case. And with product names like Core i7-1065G7 and Core i7-1065G7, which chip is better and in what area is so murky, I really can't see how anyone other than a hardcore enthusiast will truly know what they are getting. I feel like regular consumers know the old higher number is better trick, but with these names and I guess with these products as well, that sort of deduction is impossible. So that's the baseline knowledge you need about Ice Lake to kick off this performance review. Today I'm focusing on the top-end Core i7 model, as I said earlier, the i7-1065G7, so a quad-core CPU with G7 graphics. This video will be discussing everything you need to know about productivity and compute performance. We'll be comparing Ice Lake to previous 14 nanometer parts, but gaming is something we'll be tackling in a separate video. There's lots to say on both topics, so keeping this video targeted at productivity does make the most sense for now. The laptop I have with Ice Lake inside is the new Razer Blade Stealth, a laptop design that I really like and have liked for a while now with its super sleek metal design and high-end components. It also tends to provide a really great test platform. The CPU inside this beast can be configured at both its standard 15-watt TDP or at a higher 25-watt TDP, giving us useful data for both. It also packs dual-channel memory at the maximum LPDDR4X 3733 speed, so we're getting the full memory bandwidth improvements of Ice Lake in this test system too, which is ideal. The model I have also includes a discrete GPU, NVIDIA's GeForce GTX 1650 Max-Q. For most tests, this GPU has been disabled so we can focus on the compute performance of the new integrated Gen 11 graphics, but in some cases it's also enabled. I have test data from an MSI Prestige 14 which packs the 6-core i7-10710U and GTX 1650 Max-Q as well, so we can also get, I guess, a decent look at whether Ice Lake or Comet Lake is better when a more powerful discrete GPU is thrown into the picture. We're going to kick things off here as usual with a look at Cinebench R20, which gives us that all-important look at multi and single-threaded performance. The results here for Ice Lake and 10 nanometer are quite disappointing, but not entirely unexpected given the lower clock speeds this CPU is able to run at. The Core i7-1065G7 sits among the Core i5-10210U and Core i7-8565U towards the bottom of the charts. These are all quad-core CPUs operating at 15 watts. There clearly isn't much to be gained here moving from 14 nanometer to 10 nanometer in this power envelope. The new Core i7-10710U with 6 cores demolishes the Core i7-1065G7 in multi-threaded performance here. The 10710U is a good 32% faster. However, the 1065G7 does very well with single-threaded performance, outperforming most other CPUs in this table, which bodes well for Ice Lake and other single-threaded benchmarks. When bumping the 1065G7 up to 25 watts, only then is it able to outperform the 10710U in its 15-watt configuration. But when both chips are operating at the same TDP, the 6-core option is still far superior. Looking at clock speeds, there aren't too many surprises given our rated clock speed discussion earlier. Like all 15-watt CPUs, under a sustained Cinebench run, clock speeds are well below the maximum all-core turbo frequency for most of the run, so power consumption doesn't exceed 15 watts. The 14nm Core i5-10210U sits between 2.2 and 2.3 GHz all-core in this run, while the 10nm Core i7-1065G7 drops down to 1.8 to 1.9 GHz. All three of these CPUs score roughly the same in this benchmark, but the 14nm chip needs to be clocked around 22% higher. This ends up being quite similar to the difference in rated boost clocks we saw earlier, which was 23%, and also similar to Intel's IPC improvement claims for Ice Lake at an 18% average. The downside here being that while Ice Lake is able to do more per clock and perform as well as 14nm parts, there is no material improvement to efficiency. This is pretty concerning for a new process tech, although it also speaks volumes about what Intel has been able to do with 14nm and its continual refinements. After all, this is 10nm up against 14nm plus, and those pluses do make a small difference with these mobile parts. For those thinking about a desktop Ice Lake processor, if we got perfect scaling with Cinebench R20 results, Intel would be able to make a 4GHz 10nm CPU run like a 4.8GHz 14nm CPU. But there are many question marks here. I mean, can Intel get Ice Lake running at 4GHz all-core, especially over what would need to be 8 cores? Given boost clocks for mobile parts, that seems like it might be tricky. Would it even be as efficient at these frequencies, and would it improve performance? We'll have to wait for desktop 10nm parts to get answers to those questions, but you can see why Intel is sticking with 14nm on the desktop for now. Let's look at some more benchmarks. Cinebench R15 has the 1065G7 slightly ahead of the Core i5 and Core i7 14nm models we've just been talking about, but there's no significant gains to be made compared to the 10710U with its 6 cores. The 1065G7 is still 24% slower. Single thread performance is very good, as we saw previously. Handbrake is where the boys get separated from the men, as this multiple hour-long benchmark really stresses the long-term steady-state performance of these chips. Again, when constrained to 15 watts, there's really no advantage to CPU performance here over previous generation parts. We're about 23% slower than the 10710U, while the higher clocked Core i7-8565U actually outperforms the 1065G7 by a few minutes. Very similar story with X264 encoding, although this time the 1065G7 is marginally slower than 14nm equivalents, such as the Core i5-10210U. In anything multi-threaded like this, there just aren't many gains to be had from Intel's 10nm process. It's not all bad for Ice Lake though. Single thread performance is very strong, and here looking at a single instance of Premiere's warp stabilizer effect, we can see that the 1065G7 is at least 8% faster than last gen 14nm CPUs and 12% faster than Intel's lower clocked 10710U. We saw hints of that in Cinebench, but here we can see the material difference, with Ice Lake shaving a minute off this workload. What about another good result for Ice Lake? Well, here is Adobe Photoshop's Iris Blur filter, and again we see strong performance out of the Core i7-1065G7. This CPU is 8% faster than the 10710U and 17% faster than the 10210U, which is a really strong showing. While this isn't a single-threaded test, it's quite memory intensive given the size of the photo we're working with, so I believe we're seeing good gains here in part from the massive improvement to memory bandwidth we get thanks to Ice Lake's new memory controller. But when we move back to these long-term multi-threaded tests, again, it's not good news for Ice Lake. In this Blender benchmark run, which is run on the CPU for all of these processors, the 1065G7 is slower than 14nm equivalents like the Core i7-8565U. It's not massively slower, but ideally you'd like to see some sort of gain in the 15-watt power class. That is only provided by the 6-core 10710U, which matches the performance of the 1065G7 at 25 watts. 7-zip continues the story we've been showing for a while now. Even though this is a short workload, it's multi-threaded, and the 1065G7 ends up falling behind the Core i5-10210U. The margins aren't massive or within single digits for most of these 10nm versus 14nm quad-core comparisons, but still not that impressive. Few more workloads to go, this time our brand new MATLAB benchmark, which is a real-world usage of differential equations and fast Fourier transforms, which are common tasks people perform in this engineering tool. This workload hits just a few threads and also can be quite memory and cache intensive, so with Ice Lake seeing gains in these areas, MATLAB performance is higher than other 10th generation parts. 13% gains here over 10th gen is very decent. What about Adobe PDF exporting, which is another more single-threaded task? Yep, Ice Lake again performs well here, like we've seen in other single-thread workloads. 10% better performance than the Core i7-10710U is a good result and is in line with what we've shown so far. Unfortunately, Ice Lake isn't that fast in VeroCrypt Decryption, matching the 8565U and surprisingly falling well behind the Core i5-10210U. COMET Lake possibly has enhancements to improve accelerated AES performance that other architectures don't. I think testing further 10th gen CPUs will give more insights into this benchmark. With all the CPU limited tests out of the way, let's take a look at some compute workloads, because this is where Ice Lake will really shine thanks to its much faster Gen 11 GPU. Our new Premiere benchmark is a prime example of this. We're able to take advantage of Premiere's hardware accelerated encoding on top of GPU accelerated effects to deliver significant gains. In its stock configuration with no dedicated GPU, the Core i7-1065G7 outperforms most other configurations, including the Core i5-10210U with an MX250 GPU. It also demolishes 14nm parts, 75% faster than the i7-10710U, and more than twice as fast as the i5-10210U, all thanks to huge GPU gains. What's also impressive to see is that when the GPU is kept constant, in this case the GTX 1650 Max-Q, Ice Lake is still marginally faster in this workload compared to the 6-core 10710U. I think a lot of that comes down to better accelerated encoding. But overall, if Premiere is your main workload, Ice Lake is the way to go with better warp stabilizer performance and better encoding performance. When using our older Premiere benchmark, which is more GPU intensive, gains aren't as significant, especially compared to some of the discrete GPU options. Pairing a 10210U with an MX250, for example, is much faster, although consumes a lot more power. And Ice Lake falls behind Comet Lake with 6 cores versus 4 cores when the GTX 1650 Max-Q is held constant. We also see huge performance gains in CompuBench optical flow with a more than 2x advantage comparing Gen 11 graphics to older 14nm options. When fully GPU limited like this, it's no surprise to see the much higher execution unit count on Ice Lake take control and deliver a big performance improvement. Similar gains are available with Photoshop's Smart Sharpen filter, which is also run on the GPU. 130% faster performance from Ice Lake compared to Comet Lake and other Skylake derivative CPUs is a huge gain, and it slightly nudges out the MX250 from Nvidia, which is awesome from an integrated option. It also ends up handily beating AMD's Ryzen mobile offerings in this test. I suspect higher memory bandwidth to the GPU is playing a part there, given we just saw Ryzen performing well in optical flow. So that's all the data in. Many hours of benchmarking in there, and in general I haven't seen too many surprises given all the information we had in the lead up to this release. I wasn't expecting much in the realm of CPU performance, but I was expecting decent gains to GPU performance, and that's largely what has occurred. When we look at some performance summaries, we can see that the Core i7-1065G7 delivers roughly equivalent multi-threaded CPU performance to the Core i5-10210U. So when comparing quad cores on Intel's 10nm and 14nm nodes, basically nothing has been gained here. Single-threaded performance is somewhat higher, around the 10% mark, but this is offset by the occasional slower multi-threaded results. In general, I think it's fair to say performance is about even here. And it's similar comparing the Core i7-1065G7 to the Whiskey Lake Core i7-8565U. There are some larger than expected gains here for workloads like MATLAB and Photoshop Iris Blur, but in longer tests like Handbrake, Ice Lake actually clocks in slower. On average, the i7-1065G7 is a few percent faster, but it's not a mind-blowing difference, and certainly in these CPU-limited workloads, there's not much of a reason to upgrade from any of the 8th generation parts or newer. It gets even worse for Ice Lake when you compare the best Intel has to offer within 15 watts. The Core i7-10710U smokes the Core i7-1065G7 in multi-threaded workloads, so if you want to use your ultra-portable for anything intensive like video encoding, a Comet Lake 6-core CPU is a much better option. At the same time, Ice Lake is generally faster in single-threaded tests, so it will depend what sort of things you want to do with your laptop as to what processor makes more sense. The margins don't change too much when comparing 25-watt configurations. More power does equal more performance, and in this case Ice Lake is about 20 to 25% faster in its 25-watt mode compared to 15 watts, but so is Comet Lake, so it's a bit of a nil-all draw. If you're expecting to see notably better efficiency at these higher power targets, so far that doesn't seem to be the case on the mobile side. On the other hand, Ice Lake is clearly much faster when you need GPU acceleration. In pure GPU limited situations, Ice Lake's unlocked Gen 11 GPU is more than twice as fast as the crappy integrated GPU we've had from Skylake derivatives, and that's all within the same 15-watt power envelope. In a mixed workload like Premiere, that can lead to huge performance improvements. So overall, my early impressions of Intel's Ice Lake processor are a bit mixed. From testing the fastest 15-watt configuration available, there are certainly some positive takeaways. faster single-threaded performance, hugely improved GPU performance, and improved memory bandwidth, but this is spoiled by issues in other areas. Getting effectively zero improvement to multi-threaded performance is concerning for Intel's new 10nm node. Considering the CPUs I've tested have all been locked to 15 watts of power consumption, getting no performance gains from 10nm versus 14nm means we're also seeing no gains to efficiency. Yeah, it's cool that Ice Lake appears to have much improved IPC, but this has been entirely offset by the CPU running at lower clock speeds. Lower clock speeds, higher IPC, same power, same performance. It's a nil-all draw, which is a disappointing result given how long we've been waiting for a new manufacturing node from Intel. And this handily allows Comet Lake to swoop in, offering a 6-core CPU in the same power envelope for significant gains to multi-threaded performance. Again, doesn't apply to single-thread applications where Ice Lake holds a lead, but for anything that loads up the CPU, Comet Lake is the way to go. I think Intel has missed a trick here by not also offering 6 cores for Ice Lake. That could have really been a compelling choice. Granted, I haven't done any battery life testing with this new platform as it's nearly impossible to get a good apples to apples comparison, but same performance at same power level shouldn't translate to improvements here. If anything, gains will come from other platform advantages like changes to the way power gating is handled, different boost technologies, more efficient memory and so on. But on face value and performance intensive tasks, I don't think Ice Lake is going to be delivering all that much. And getting a much faster GPU with Ice Lake is nice, but it's not a revolutionary upgrade given AMD has been offering this sort of performance since late 2017 with Ryzen Mobile. This is more about Intel bringing their part up to a competitive graphics standpoint and finally offering something beyond 2015 level performance. It's just not pushing the boundaries. In fact, in some instances, Ice Lake's 64 execution unit GPU still falls behind 1st gen Ryzen Mobile depending on the power limitations. At other times, it's faster depending on how much memory bandwidth is required, given Ice Lake does have a big advantage in that department. Intel also has to compete with discrete GPU offerings, including Nvidia's popular MX150 and MX250, as well as newer, more powerful options like the GeForce GTX 1650 Max-Q that was included with my Razer Blade Stealth test system. It depends heavily on the exact workload in question, but Ice Lake's integrated GPU isn't much faster than Comet Lake with an MX250, the exception to this rule being Premiere, where a combination of factors makes Ice Lake a much better option. As it stands right now, the outright fastest hardware combination I've seen in ultra-portable form factors appears to be Intel's Core i7-1065G7 paired with the GTX 1650 Max-Q, which you can get in MSI's Prestige 14. If Razer, for example, had swapped out the i7-1065G7 for an i7-10710U in this latest Blade Stealth, I suspect in most workloads it would be superior, aside from some single-threaded edge cases. So while it's neat that Ice Lake has this much improved integrated GPU, given it doesn't bring forward CPU performance with it, we're really not seeing improvements over what was already possible with 14nm. OEMs have been increasingly opting for discrete GPUs in their ultra portables, and Ice Lake doesn't end up offering greatly improved performance over these configurations. If you bought an 8th gen laptop a few years ago with an MX150, Ice Lake isn't much of an upgrade. Where you will see gains are in laptops that don't use a discrete GPU. If an OEM decides that they want to include one chip, then something like the Core i7-1065G7 is going to give a large compute performance gain over, say, an 8th gen Core i7-8565U by itself. But for the last few years, I've found it hard to recommend laptops that don't feature some form of discrete GPU, even in 13-inch ultra portables. So this situation really only applies to the less creative OEMs that haven't bothered to innovate, while Intel has been stagnant on the GPU front. So yeah, pretty lackluster and disappointing start to Intel's 10nm series. The lack of efficiency gains here is really hurting Intel. I hope that with a 10nm revision, or perhaps just a full step forward to 7nm, that this will improve significantly. Otherwise, they will be stomped all over by next-gen Ryzen Mobile on TSMC's 7nm. I think this product is clearly indicative of Intel's struggles with 10nm as well. They've barely just been able to get 10nm good enough to not be embarrassingly bad up against 14nm. Performance equivalent is really the bare acceptable minimum here, and they've slipped in some architectural changes like a faster GPU to at least provide something different. But I don't think this is what Intel would have been hoping for when they first set out to develop their 10nm node and accompanying products. That's it for this one. I'll be back next week for a look at Ice Lake's GPU performance in gaming, so more content is still to come on this topic. Stay tuned. As always, you can support our work directly through our Patreon page or merch store. Thanks for watching. This has been a long one. Time to get back to some more testing, and I'll catch you in the next one.